It's go time.
Welcome, everyone, to Quick Kicks here on Third Down Gamble. I'm Don Charbon, and a very special guest from the Saskatchewan Roughriders is joining me tonight. Rob Vanstone, senior journalist and Riders historian. Rob, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Don. Great to be with you again.
It's always great to talk to you. Now, you are in a new position with the Saskatchewan Roughriders. You had been with the leader post in Regina for 36 years, something over 13,000 days, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I figured it out one time, 13,100 and something, I think. Continuously. I just never went home.
I can imagine. Life of a journalist is not a 9-to-5 job ever.
Never. I remember the days when it was 9 to 5 because it would start at 9 p.m. and end at 5 in the morning. So it's a different time, a different era.
Very true. It was about, February 23rd that this all came to culmination. But let's go before that. Who came to whom, and how was this all processed?
I sent an email to Craig Reynolds on a Sunday night, Craig Reynolds being the Roughriders president and CEO, on a Sunday night about 11 p.m., just indicating that it was just kind of a feeler, just asking if that'd be something they would be interested in doing. There's been that model with some other teams, the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, especially with the wonderful Ed Tate. You know, we've seen it with NHL.com and Dave Stubbs and the amazing stuff that he does and et cetera, et cetera. It's not really a unique model anymore. And I just kind of put a feeler out. Turns out they were interested. It took 7 days and 24 minutes from beginning to end. From first chat with Craig Reynolds at 3:02 p.m. on a Monday afternoon to signing an offer the following Monday at 3:26 p.m. So it all came together with shocking speed. I didn't expect anything to kind of come of it, really. You know, the way things have been going with the newspaper industry, it was almost like I was just trying to give myself a landing spot if something were to go completely south. And it had been a tough week leading up to that, and it had been really stressful. And it was just kind of a casual email. And then when Craig responded, sounding very interested, the interest was reciprocal. It turned into something I think both parties really wanted to happen and wanted to happen very, very quickly. And I'm so flattered and honored by their interest, and I still can't believe it's real. It's been almost 2 months, and I still go in there and expect someone to escort me out of there at some point. I feel like I'm intruding. So cool. When I sat down for the first formal interview, I had a informal coffee with Craig Reynolds on that Monday afternoon, and then the following Thursday I met with Anthony Partapillo, the chief brand officer, and Ariel Zur, the director of communications, and I kind of had it in my mind what I'd like it to be, and then as they outlined the job description, it was pretty much everything I had on my list. I was totally disarmed by the way they described it. I hadn't really given them any inkling of what I was expecting or hoping for. They just defined it, and I walked out of that room just with my head spinning. It was just amazing. I remember driving home from the interview, and I felt a sudden inclination. I got to call my mom and tell her about this. And then I started getting all weepy because my mom passed away in December 2019. And I'd always shared things like that with mom. And so I actually had to pull over because I was really teary, right? It was just, as long as they followed up with an offer, I was going to say yes. And I'm so glad I did. It's not many people who get to say they've had 2 dream jobs in a lifetime. And that's how blessed I've been.
It's not often when both sides have the same terms of reference when they're coming into a meeting to discuss a job opportunity.
I was floored by it. I mean, just the fact that they were amenable to it so quickly. I had no grand plan. It was just kind of like, do you think there's something like this could maybe work? Kind of, maybe, sort of. Oh yeah. And they had been wanting to do more in terms of content. That had been one of their priorities during the off season. They wanted there to be more on Riderville.com, and they wanted to engage with the fans more directly and more frequently, and it was just really, really fluky and fortuitous timing on my part. There was no intuition. There was no, gentle subtle nudge in the ribs. There'd been no overtures from them. It was just a casual email that just turned into something wonderful. Here we are. It's still weird. I spent a lot of time working in the alumni lounge at Mosaic Stadium, so I'm sitting there looking at this football field in this immaculate stadium. This is my office. It's just so surreal.
Well, especially for a person that was, I wouldn't necessarily say was on the other side, but you were always coming there to find out stuff, to get opinions on stuff, to review what had happened with the team, and suddenly now you've crossed over and are speaking for the team.
Yeah, it's a different role. It's a different, a bit of a different mindset. But the one thing that hasn't changed is that I'm very passionate about that football team. And, in a way, I felt like I'd crossed over in the summer of 1996 when suddenly I went from season ticket holder to writing about the Roughriders when I was appointed sports columnist. I never applied for that job. They just decided one day I would be the sports columnist. Thank you, Bob Hughes. You can't really be a sports columnist in Regina without writing about the Roughriders. And I'd kind of had it arranged where I just wanted to be the hockey writer for life, so I could just go to Rider games and not have to cover them and just enjoy them strictly as a fan. And so that's where I felt I actually kind of crossed over, because that was a huge threshold to not sit in section 204, row 14, seat 23, and to not lose my voice at a Rider game, things like that. That was a way tougher transition than this one has been. A lot of the things that I'm passionate about and that have followed for years, it just feels like I'm doing a lot of times the same job, just for a different platform.
Now, how difficult was it for you to go into the leader post for the last time and look around and see those faces that you've been with and worked with and know that this was it? This was going to be my last day after this much time.
It made it a little easier in that we aren't working in the office anymore. I'll always call them we. Now I'm calling the Riders we, and I'm calling the leader post we. I got to decide which we is actually we now. They're both so close to my heart. So I reserve the right to refer to the leader post as we. We weren't in the newsroom anymore, and our space at 1964 Park Street wasn't the original space that we once occupied. So the tougher part was in 2019 when I cleaned out my desk and moved it to a different part of the building in a new surrounding. That was the way tougher transition. I hadn't grown as attached to the other workspace because it was just not what I was traditionally used to. The leaving the people was tough. I mean, I never really felt like I had colleagues. They were all friends. Taking that last walk out of the newsroom and turning off the lights. I did take a little video of it with my iPhone as I walked out, just kind of to document it. But the friendships endure. The people that I've gotten to know really well, we still keep in touch, and that's not going anywhere. Colin McGarrigle, the new managing editor of the Leader Post, could not have been nicer and more understanding and more accommodating. He took what was could have been a really tough phone conversation after I signed the Roughriders offer. The first thing I did was phone call him, and he was just sensational about it. And I'll always be indebted to him for that, and indebted to everybody at the LP for meaning so much to me over the years. And the relationship isn't severed. I'm still a subscriber.
On your first day going to Mosaic, did you maybe make a wrong turn?
No, I couldn't figure out the elevator. I thought maybe they've heard about me. The elevator won't go to the fourth floor. So I'm standing there pressing 4 on the morning of February 21st. And there's no elevator. And it was like the elevator that Otis forgot. And it's like, maybe they've heard about me. This elevator is not ascending. And then the Carol Hoving, the ticket control officer, happened to, again, more fortuitous timing, happened to come to work, and she was able to get us to the fourth floor. So I was stranded there for about 2 minutes before I could actually get to the office, just standing in the elevator wondering what to do. I had no security card at that time or anything, so there was no way of, I presume I just wasn't able to activate the elevator that Carol was able to, to suddenly propel. So that was the funny part. The toughest part of the first day was actually getting to the fourth floor.
That's funny. I guess with any building, I mean, security is one thing, moving around is quite another.
Yeah, it's funny how it works. I didn't really feel like I had the cardio to make it up the stairs. So, and I didn't even know where they were at the time, actually. So that first day was just it was overwhelming, and there really hasn't been anything since then to change that. I just everybody is so nice and supportive and just encouraging and welcoming. It kind of had me on my heels the first day I walked in there, and that hasn't changed a bit. I think my appreciation for it just only grows each day. And so do I, because I've gained about 10 pounds since I started there, because there's just there's too many chocolates. Gotta stop eating the chocolates that Rob Harrison has on his desk.
We talked sort of briefly about the terms of reference, but what was the expectation of the job? What did they want you to do? What did you feel you could offer them? And how did that all mesh? What were the actual details of this?
It's still pretty open-ended. I mean, they were the ones who defined the term rider historian when they gave me the job description. That's what it said. It was never really spelled out, but I guess that was, implicit in the job description was the expectation that I'd be the historian. That's certainly something that I was hoping to do. And then from there, it was just a matter of where do we go with that? Well, we want to upgrade and update the historical base of the Rough Riders as it exists on riderville.com. I'm working on an all-time player list and an all-time coaches list, and upgrading the team records and lists of all-stars, etc. There's just a number of things that can be done there. So I've been busy with that. I think, primarily though, we want to get stories on the website about the players, the coaches, the employees, tell people what's going on, have a little fun with it, as well. And my pledge to them when I started was there'll be something fresh on the website every day, 365 days a year. As we record this on April 11th, I've still lived up to that. I'm pretty pleased with that. That's a little barometer. That's an expectation I set for myself, and they seem to have no problem with it. They've been so amazing. It's just it just blows me away. I just keep thanking people. They must be getting tired of me being so gushy, but anybody who had anything to do with me getting this job, or in the case of Carol, helping me figure out the elevator, I just keep saying thank you. It's really a neat experience at 50, I was 58 then, I'm 59 now, at this stage of my career, when I think a lot of people if they haven't retired, they're certainly thinking about it, to feel this energized and this inspired and this welcomed. It's just, it's really gratifying. The problem is I just don't know when to turn off the tap, because I'm just addicted to it. And I was addicted to the previous job as well. So I guess I was just meant to be a workaholic.
There's an adage that I read about years ago, and it's do what you love and the money shall follow. And I think you're living that dream.
I remember my dad saying something along those lines. He's not the first person to say it, obviously, but I mean, it was just along the lines of, do something you love for a living, because you spend a lot of time doing it. And if it's not something you like, if it's a grind, that can be pretty taxing. And, my dad was an architect, and he loved that. And he was a jazz musician, and he loved that. He was as happy as could be doing whatever he did, either way. And so I think I've adopted that. He sounded better sitting at a keyboard than I did. I just make these clackety clack sounds. Dad had immaculate penmanship and ability to draw, and I just tried to draw a conclusion a couple of times a week. So, and my handwriting's kind of illegible, so there's no comparison there. But I just love it. I mean, I'm not a morning person by any stretch of the imagination. I had an interview with a player today at 8:30 a.m. and I was there at 8:26. That was unfathomable once upon a time. Mornings were just were just torturous for me. And I actually got up before the alarm. I don't know how that's happening.
You touched on the history side of the equation, so that would be stats, player records, coaching records. What is the value of all that? What does that do for a franchise?
I think you have to know where you've been. Right? I mean, there's so many foundational figures, and especially a team like this, it's a community-owned team that so many people have scratched and clawed to keep it going. It's not like there's some billionaire owner that just keeps writing checks. It's not one man's or one woman's empire. It has existed because a lot of people have, donated wheat in return for season tickets. It's because a lot of people have responded to telethons. It's because businessmen and business people have stepped to the fore, and the average fan has stepped up year after year after year, decade after decade. I mean, there was a Save the Team blitz, I think is 1937, I found. There was one in 1961. There was a telethon in 1987. There was a mini telethon in 1993 trying to, rustle up interest for the Sacramento game here. There was telethon 97. So, I mean, you look at the board members and, everything that they've contributed over the years, the volunteers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think you have to honor that. You have to honor those people, especially in a situation like this where it's a jewel of the community. And whether you're a season ticket holder or a board member or a player, you have a piece of it. And that history has to be not only, I think, documented, but respected and honored. And I think is part of the role. And you look outside the stadium and the two statues are Ron Lancaster and George Reed. That tells you everything about how steeped in history this franchise is. If you don't tell the story of Piffles Taylor, I don't think you've told the entire Rider story, etc. It just and I've always been kind of a history nerd anyway, so I'll always speak to that side of things. But this is a team that goes back to October 1st, 1910 in terms of its first game, and I think because I covered that game, I'm eminently qualified to be a historian.
I have my doubts you were there, but who knows? Maybe there's photographic evidence.
Well, the way my knees feel today, I think I was certainly there.
This team to this province has always had a strong connection, but even the Rough Riders' first name didn't show up until much later in their history.
Yeah, I mean, it was the Regina Rugby Club until the early 1920s, and then Rough Riders sort of came about informally and then formally. Even the transition from Regina Roughriders to Saskatchewan Roughriders came about kind of gradually. The jersey color was an accident. It's amazing, and as I trace some of these projects, it's I'm doing right now a piece of the top 10 Saskatchewan raised players in Rider history. And one of the players I'm giving strong consideration to is Fred Wilson. And he debuted with the Regina Rugby Club in 1913 and finished with the Regina Roughriders in 1928. And there's a lot of players who span both of them. You look at the all-time Grey Cup listings in 1928 or 1923, it's Regina Rugby Club playing Queen's University. And then go to 1928 and it's the Regina Roughriders making their first of 5 consecutive Grey Cup appearances.
Where do you go to find your primary sources for all of this?
Newspapers.com is a great tool. There's a number of reference books that I have, but newspapers.com, it's just got pretty much a high percentage of newspapers anywhere. So, I mean, I will always be indebted to the Morning Leader, the Regina Leader Post, the Saskatoon Star Phoenix, newspapers across Canada that have covered Canadian football over the years. They have been invaluable sources. Researchers. Edward Yoon did the definitive Rough Riders history statistical history book in the early 2000s. That is an amazing piece of work. Bob Calder, a historian out of Saskatoon, he wrote the original Rider Pride history with Gary Andrews. Graham Kelly has documented Rider history quite extensively. Steve Daniel, the CFL's head statistician is an absolute gold mine when it comes to that. A friend of mine named Tom Fuseshi is a independent researcher of all things Riders, and Tom's researched the Riders' history of radio broadcast crews dating back to 1947, and he shared some of that information with me. Ardent fans that have kept that information. Kurt Phillips did a Rider player a number of starting from 1960 onwards. He did the Rider statistical compendium of players. I'm so indebted to various researchers, and I'm able to mine some of the interviews that I've done for various Rider books over the years. I did a book on the 66 Riders and a book on the 89 Riders, etc. In so doing, I did long interviews with some people who sadly are no longer with us. In the last year of Ron Lancaster's life, I had 4 long interviews with him, and so it's nice to have that the documentation and their stories on record. And sadly we're losing. I'm 59 years old now, and it seems every second or third day I look on Twitter or wherever, and an athlete I grew up watching, whether it was in the NHL, CFL, NFL, baseball, what have you, passes away. And a lot of the people I grew up watching are in their 80s now. It just doesn't seem digestible, but you get to this age and you start losing some of your athletic heroes. I mean, April 8th would have been Gary Carter's 69th birthday, and Gary died just shy of 58. It's hard to believe that, Gary Carter isn't around anymore. And so I'm glad I had the opportunity. Glenn Dobbs, for example, passed away in 2002, and I had a chance in the last decade of his life to interview him twice. And he was such an amazingly nice man. Both times he asked me to send him a copy of the article after it was published, so I did. I mailed it to his home in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and both times he sent me a wonderful thank you note. I still have both thank you notes. And so, yeah, I'm glad more than 20 years ago now, I had the opportunity to talk to Glenn Dobbs, and I still have the transcripts of those interviews. They're treasures. I just wish I'd kept the tapes.
Glenn Dobbs, of course, led the Rough Riders to the Grey Cup, their only appearance in the 1950s, and lost to Ottawa.
Yeah, he threw a touchdown pass to Jack Nix for a 5-pointer.
Back in the day when touchdowns were only worth 5, that's right.
And I found out doing some research, Jack Nix ended up being like a jazz pianist. Left the Rough Riders in the early 50s, I think, went back down to the States and ended up being a really tremendous jazz musician. So I got to go and try and find some Jack Nix recordings. I didn't know that the Rough Riders had a jazz pianist in their employ once upon a time until I got this job. The Riders had a lineman tryout for them in 1966 out of Kansas named Richie Pratt. And turns out he was just an absolutely amazing jazz drummer. So I've broadened my appreciation of my favorite form of music since I got this job. I just wish that Jack Nix and Richie Pratt had recorded together. We just need a bass player to be a really great trio.
One of the things that has always sort of bothered me, but it seems to be getting corrected, is the custodians of the CFL history seem to be those that were motivated to do it rather than the teams or the league itself. And lately we're starting to see that change where teams are bringing on people to do their histories.
Yeah, I think retro is kind of cool. I mean, how many teams have retro days now? The Rough Riders have their retro jerseys. They're worn, selectively. You look at the NFL and what it has meant to them to have NFL films documenting their games going back to 1962 with Steve and Ed Sable, and the importance of the visual record. That's something that's really tough to find Canadian football wise. I mean, how many different, if somebody's doing like a feature on or a retrospective on Ron Lancaster, it's generally the same few, or George Reed, it's generally the same few highlights that are shown. There isn't a real, wealth of or great treasury of video. And one of the things I'm hoping to do, especially working closely with Blake Tiedemann with the Rough Riders, because there's access to some Rough Riders video, vintage stuff, and we're going to sit down one of these days and kind of hash out what we can do with this, because I think there's some lost treasures that people would really enjoy. And I got really pumped just thinking about that. Not long after I was hired, I got a text message from Blake, and I dealt with him before because I did commentaries for the Plaza of Honor inductions every year, just chatting about whoever's being inducted. So Blake would interview me, and then when I got hired, he sent me a note, and it was just so enlivening to hear how excited he was, and start bandying about all the things we might be able to do, and maybe just play a little bit of catch up. I mean, the NFL teams, even the AFL teams, they've always had the resources that, Canadian teams have not. It's not just a Canadian football issue. It's junior hockey. I mean, how many clips are there of Joe Sakic with the Swift Current Broncos, or Mike Modano with the Prince Albert Raiders, or Dennis Sobchuk with the Regina Pats? Or I've never seen a clip of Fran Huck playing with the Regina Pats or Bill Hickey, and it must have been absolutely spectacular. But there's just, there really hasn't been that sort of mindset where those things are preserved. Sometimes they're just perceived as a bunch of clutter in a file, and I don't think a lot of media outlets have done a tremendous job of storing their archives. That's where somebody like Steve Daniel at the CFL, he's worked so hard to get the statistical base to where it's been, and now I can send Steve a casual inquiry, and with 3 keystrokes, he'll find out what happened in 1953. We're lucky that there are the Steve Daniels of the world. We're lucky that there's people like, Matt Young at CTV Saskatoon, who does a weekly digging into the vault type of a series and finds old footage. And, the other day he had some clips of Ray Algard at his first training camp with the Rough Riders in 1983. Just amazing stuff. And I'm so glad, especially somebody like Matt, who wasn't even alive when that happened, and yet he feels that responsibility to in his own way, cater to those of us who just want to see history preserved and celebrated.
I've been very fortunate and we were talking about the Rough Riders and their colors. I've seen game film from 1947, the Rough Riders versus Winnipeg, in full color. So Saskatchewan is wearing red and black in that football game.
So they were the Red Blacks, right?
Predecessors. The history is a huge value. It not only teaches us about where we've been, but it also talks to us about where we're going. And that's the players. That's the coaching staff.
It's funny because I never was really that into history when I was in school. But I mean, that was hearing about the Renaissance. I really wasn't that interested in Michelangelo painting a ceiling. I just wanted to know. I was more interested in vintage CFL stuff and vintage NFL stuff, and I always liked it. And I think it's neat to unearth a little gem that has probably been sitting in a file somewhere for 60 years, and all of a sudden you find it. I found the other day that Charlie Connerly, who was like a Hall of Fame quarterback with the New York Giants, he was a guest coach at Rider training camp in 1962. I had no idea. The Riders head coach at the time happened to be Steve Owen, who a legendary New York Giants head coach, and who was inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame a few years later, posthumously, sadly. And so suddenly Charlie Connerly is a guest coach at Steve Owen's first Rider training camp. Second Riders training camp, pardon me, in 1962. Clark Shaughnessy, who sort of pioneered offensive football as we know it today, was also a Rider guest coach once upon a time. I had no idea. I did know that in 1958, Steve Belichick, Bill's dad, was a guest coach at Rider training camp. And earlier that year, I think they tried to hire Sammy Baugh as the head coach, but he ended up staying at, I think, Hardin Simmons College or University in Texas. But the Riders ruling class at the time was really, going great guns to try and get Sammy Baugh to be the head coach here. Hard to believe. And it's amazing how many cases there are of players coming to Saskatchewan or the Canadian Football, well, it wasn't the Canadian Football League back then, but whether it's the Big Four or the Western Interprovincial Football Union, players coming here because the money was better. Stan Williams played for the Dallas Texans, and then and all of a sudden he's with the Rough Riders. John Wozniak was a tremendous lineman with the Dallas Texans in 1952, and well established as a player in the States, in the NFL, with the old New York Yanks for 2 years, and with the Dallas Texans, and before that with the Brooklyn Dodgers of the All-American Football Conference, and he was in his early 30s. He suddenly shows up in Saskatchewan in 1953. Larry Isbell, a huge star at the University of Baylor, comes to Saskatchewan. There's so many of them in the 50s, Martin Ruby and Red Ettinger and Jack Russell and Jack Nixon and Glenn Dobbs and on and on and on. They came, and there were so many of them. They came to Canada because it was actually a better opportunity in a lot of ways. And you'd still see traces of that into the 1970s when there were periodic bidding wars where players would not like their initial offer and come to Canada. You'd get players into the early 70s, early to mid 70s, who'd come to the CFL even if they were drafted by an NFL team. Jim Warden was drafted, by the Dallas Cowboys, ended up coming to Saskatchewan instead. Never went to Dallas. It's unfathomable. So now you look at the draft. If you're a 6th round pick, you have a pretty good chance of making the team down there. Draft capital is pretty huge in the NFL now. But once upon a time, you'd get a 4th or 5th round pick that had decided to come to Canada because there was a better offer. You get a number 1 overall pick like Tom Cousineau, or a high pick like Keith Gary, or 1992 Rocket or 91 Rocket Ismail. That was a bit of an anomaly back then, but you saw it more often in the 1980s. Terry Metcalf comes to Toronto in 1978 because they can offer more money they did offer more money than the St. Louis Cardinals did. You didn't see that as often in Saskatchewan in the 60s and 70s. It was like Toronto and Montreal doing that for the most part. But in the 50s, you'd get the Martin Rubies and the John Wozniaks and the Larry Isbells and Stan Williams, Glenn Dobbs, on and on and on. It was amazing the type of players they get. Max Speedy was inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame a few years back, and he finished his pro football career in Canada and played with the Rough Riders in the early 50s. Tremendous receiver with one of Otto Graham's favorite targets with the Cleveland Browns, and he played for the Rough Riders because they were making him a better offer than Paul Brown was. I mean, it's stunning to me. It still blows me away. Bobby Marlowe out of Alabama. He was just a stud player in college, comes to Canada. On and on and on. There's so many examples like that. And it's amazing to immerse myself in them. I can't get enough of that. And I have license to do it. I did before, but now there's really no limits on it. It's just everything is green and white now.
Is it fair to say that you've got a bit of an eidetic memory?
I'm not sure because my memory isn't good enough to remember what eidetic means. Help.
Photographic.
It's pretty selective. Like my wife laughs at it. She says, like, who carried the ball of the 3rd play against BC in 1971, but you can't remember to take out the garbage. She's absolutely right there. It's really just fanatically focused on some things that I really, really, really get interested in. But in terms of practical knowledge, I need instructions to figure out how to use a toothbrush.
I'm sure for the Rough Riders, this is exactly what they were hoping for. The enthusiasm, the historical knowledge, all melded into great storytelling.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm so flattered you would say that, Don. They've been nothing but nice and amazing about it. I'm just, like I said earlier, I'm just so indebted. I'm still kind of feeling my way into it. We're still trying to, figure out how everything is going to work. Is sort of a slow time. It's been crazy for me with the adjustment and everything. And the off season is a very busy time when it comes to selling season tickets and getting game preparations ready, game themes. I had a long chat earlier today with Seth Strankman, who is amazing at what he does, just putting together the theme games. Eva Fletcher and Anthony Partapillo, the chief brand officer. I mean, Anthony used to work for the Blue Jays. I mean, the intellect and the capabilities of these people is ridiculous. And, I see them doing what they do. And in some ways, the off season's a bit of a peak period for them, and that, you're not going to just book Kim Mitchell or, somebody like that to play at your football game the day before the game. You got to work on that, long time in advance. So it's showtime in a lot of ways for somebody like, Seth Strankman. But I'm really interested to see what it's like covering a game, working for the Roughriders. The plan is to travel with the team. I'm going to be with the team for all of training camp in Saskatoon. That's something I've never done before. I haven't made a lot of Rider road trips. I've made way more Rider road trips as a fan with my mom than I have in my writing career. Rough Rider Grey Cup games aside, I don't think I've been to 5 Rider road games just to cover them. I'll go to more than that this season. That's really intriguing, just to be embedded and just the story possibilities there. I think that's where where the team and myself will really get a feel for how this is gonna roll out and what kind of cool things can be done. Right now, there's still a bit of getting to know you, and once the season starts and there's, I think, more of a routine developing and football season is in full swing, I'm so excited about what that is going to bring. And I'm also very curious because I've never seen it, from the inside before. It's just, it's been really eye-opening and really just great fun. I keep referring to Seth, but Seth and John Phillips is just a genius. And John handles a lot of really high-level website things, and just, I'm trying to remember even how to describe his job. Like, it's so incomprehensible to me that I can't even remember the job title offhand, but it's just really intricate stuff. And Seth and John were having a conversation my second or third day in the lunchroom, and they were speaking English, and I didn't understand a word they were saying because it was also CRM programmer analyst is John's title. And they were discussing things about the Maxtron and how things go on the Maxtron. And I had no idea what they were talking about. And they were talking about that like you and I would talk about the 89 Grey Cup. It was just, I couldn't believe the level of sheer genius that was in that conversation. And the intricacies to the nth degree of the material they were discussing. I just kind of quietly snuck to the back of the lunchroom and just made coffee. Everybody's just so incredibly smart and so incredibly great at what they do, and they're empowered to do it. And I'm really anxious to see it all roll out during football season once it's showtime. You have the draft, and there's the combine, and there's certain little signposts during the off season, the free agency period, and Trevor Harris signing here on February 14th. That's the biggest Rider story of the year to date. To see it in action, that is going to be so cool when it's the entirety of what I do. And am I going to miss the leader post? I'll always miss the leader post. I loved my time there, and what I'm doing now is not intended, or my decision to leave is not intended as a slight against them. Sometimes just when you've been doing something for a long time, you need something fresh, something new. And this was just something I just could not even fathom turning down once it came to be. And it's just really neat to see it from this side, and just realize how lucky I am to not only be where I am, but to work with the people that I'm so blessed to work with. It's stunning to me.
And it's all going to start ramping up.
Main camp begins May 14th. Rookie camp is a few days before that. I've completed high level negotiations in order to get my bike up to Saskatoon, so I can go get some exercise in after practices are done. So I'm going to miss my dog. That's going to be so cool. I've never covered training camp unless it's been in Regina. And suddenly here I am being in Saskatoon for a month. I'm just giving Saskatoon fair warning. That is going to be so fascinating. It's like a transition from what I was doing, but what did I do when I was a kid? After school, I would go to University of Regina and watch training camp. That's what I did. I still have my 1973 Rider training camp prospectus, right? 76, 77, 78. I still got my home movies from 1978 training camp at the U of R, Ron Lancaster's last training camp. And I'd take my dog Snowball out to training camp, and that's what I do. In a way, it's kind of going right back to my roots as a sports fan, and that is so interconnected with following the Saskatchewan Roughriders with my mom.
Looking forward to reading a lot more from you on riderville.com. And Rob Vanstone, thank you so much for taking the time to talk about this. All the best. It couldn't have happened to a better guy. I think they made the right decision.
Oh, you're so kind, Don. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to our show. Third Down Gamble is hosted on Podbean and can be found on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. Follow us on Twitter at Third Down Gamble. Join us again, the Third Down Gamble podcast, audio worth watching.
Third Down Gamble uses the expert resources provided by Canadian Football League player and game statistics for analytics, game notes, and statistics, and 3downnation.com for news, insight, and in-depth analysis. Please visit cfl.ca and 3downnation.com for the most up-to-date information on the Canadian Football League.